Magda, we got
Hello,
Magda
everyone.
Maaoui from University of Cergy-Paris.
I'll share my screen and please let me know if you have trouble seeing it. Is everybody seeing it and it's shared? Perfect. Thanks for having me. I'm so thrilled for the opportunity to discuss these topics with you all today. I have a double background of being right now affiliated with a French university, the University of Cergy-Paris, and working also on France and French housing policy, but also knowing a little bit about the American housing policy system as I got my PhD from Columbia University. And I do comparative work, generally speaking. My research actually looks at how politics and power relations have shaped inclusionary zoning outcomes in French and American historically disinvested municipalities, as well as wealthier, often exclusionary municipalities. This comparative political economy that I do is based on sociological and econometric research. And my goal is to try and produce policy relevant, actionable findings for legislators, planners, advocacy organizations that are, on both sides of the Atlantic, trying to rethink land use systems and adopt, for instance, mandated fair share programs, which is the topic of my presentation today. So today I'll provide a brief overview of the French social housing sector. I'll then introduce you to the SRU mandatory fair share law that I work on specifically. I'll end by focusing on a few recommendations that I think could incentivize local municipalities to invest in social housing developments in Rhode Island, as well as lessons, generally speaking, from the French context that might be salient to local US municipalities. So my work focuses on the SRU law, which was intended to encourage social housing development in municipalities across the country as a way to reduce segregation. And its ambitious goals were complemented by financial penalties for cities that didn't hit their targets. One might expect that with those financial penalties, those fees would motivate those cities to build more. But in fact, what my research shows is that after the fee went into place, municipalities that were subject to it saw their social housing stock grow more slowly than in places that were exempt from the fee. So this raises a lot of questions about the use of different strategies to change behavior, be they incentives, or penalties or mandates. And also it illustrates how much other factors like political leadership, a big topic of my research, really weighs heavily on these outcomes. Beyond the adoption of a national fee, a national program for non-compliant municipalities, social housing production trends are impacted by the types of land use ideologies, I call them land use ideologies, that are in place in municipalities, be they pro-social housing or exclusionary. So a quick context first to sort of put the big metrics and a few facts and numbers to show why the comparison works and how to draw lessons from the French context. When I talk about social housing, I refer exclusively to social rental housing, which represents housing units with capped rents. Access to social housing is linked to two metrics in France: household composition and household income. The social housing stock is particularly large in France. To give you a few numbers, between 15% and 17% of the population occupies social housing units. The management of France's 4.5 million housing units, there are social housing units, is split between, on the one hand, local government entities similar to public housing authorities in the US, and on the other hand, public-private partnerships, which are a growing system or mode of social housing management right now. Social housing construction gets financed in multiple ways. For instance, you have government subsidies, reduced value-added tax on construction, or low-interest loans from what we call the Caisse des dépôts et consignations, which is the National Public Investment Bank in charge of housing financing. Projects are carried either by municipal housing developers or national developers that win a bid, or private developers also who are bounded to build affordable housing. So social housing buildings are typically operated by municipal authorities, intermunicipal authorities, and the state, and they can be financed by a mix of funding sources from different levels of government. Generally speaking, another element that you need to keep in mind is that the specific policies over social housing have evolved in France since the post-war era, because it's a country like any other country. But really, what has prevailed is the support of rental unit construction, because the government considered it as an attractive investment over the past 3, 4, 5 decades. And I'm so sorry for the background noise, because right now I'm not calling from Paris, but from New York. Apologies for that. Now, there's 3 income categories that determine the allocation of housing units. From 2000 to 2017, the balance was roughly half of units for the lowest income categories, a third for moderate income households, and then a remaining 10% that was mostly for middle income households. I insist on this balance between all kinds of income categories because it shows that really there's this idea to pursue social mix in who gets access to social housing units in France. I'll take the example of Paris to give you a few numbers, sort of like put numbers in everybody's heads. If we take Paris, since 2001, there's been 110,000 new social housing units that were created, either through construction or just rehab and transformation, of units that were private market to social housing. Roughly 2/3 were new construction, and then a third was rehab or acquisition. And then to situate you more, again, because I happen to be from France, I happen to be French and work on the French housing policy sector, but I want to resituate France in the European context, because you could be asking me, why am I not comparing the case of Rhode Island to the UK, to Scandinavia, to Germany? France, where it sits, generally speaking, in comparison to other European housing markets, it's characterized by social housing production that has been increasing, unlike most of Europe, since 2008. The issue of Europe slowing down on housing construction, the specifically social housing units, has, of course, to be embedded within the context of a larger housing shortage crisis, which has characterized most markets since 2008. In comparison, France fares better than the UK, which has seen its housing construction in terms of social housing decline by 40% since the 70s. And also it fares better than Germany, where housing construction is now roughly half the 1990s levels. It also has to be situated in comparison to better cases or better models. Scandinavia, which I'm sure you take any field, any topic in the world, Scandinavia always does it better. But I have to acknowledge that they're very good at social housing as well. So France would be just, second to them in a lot of aspects. So that's just to give you a sense of where it stands in comparison to its neighbors. A few key facts and observations still to give you an idea of what we're talking about. It's just the sheer scale of public sector involvement in the French housing market, with about 40% of renters who live in social housing. In the US, it's closer to 2 to 5%, depending on how you define social housing. Another thing that's important is that, and it's part of, in big part due to the program or the law that I studied, the SRU, France has built about almost 2 million social housing units between 2001 and 2019, or about 100,000 per year. In comparison, the low-income housing tax credit program also builds about 100,000 low-income units per year, but the US has 5 times the population of France. Additionally, I know I talk a lot about rental housing, but I want to insist on the fact that homeownership is still also quite popular. In France, almost 60% of French households own their homes, versus about 2/3 of US households, and it's also been very supported, subsidized by the government. Last, a few more recent key trends that I want to insist on. One that has to do with the fact that social housing, and I think it connects with our previous presentation where you mentioned the case of Uruguay and this project that was open to all kinds of professions. I want to insist on the fact that social housing does indeed represent in large part, post-war modernist housing projects that could be compared to what we call the projects in the US, decaying social housing stock that's concentrating mostly the lowest income band of French society, but it is also characterized by a lot of social mix. Like most of today's social housing is attributed to certain essential professions like teachers, firefighters, city agents, nurses, etc. And I want to insist on this fact to resituate what the profiles of social housing tenants are. The second important trend is, of course, the pandemic, which has unsurprisingly messed up a lot of things, construction rhythms and growth cycles in France. To give you an idea, in 2017, France was permitting 240,000 units. And then in 2021, it went as low as 180,000, which shows that there's been, a big slowing down, decrease of construction. And I think the contrast with the US context is that the safety nets were stronger in France in terms of trying to mitigate what the pandemic has generated in terms of impacting the housing cycles and the crisis in general. So now a lot of focus on the SRU specifically. It requires most municipalities to hit a target of 25% of their housing stock to be social housing. At the time the law passed in 2000, a lot of municipalities didn't have any social housing at all. And social housing that did exist in France tended to be concentrated in poorer, more segregated areas. Today, I will give you a bit of background and show you what types of problems this program was trying to solve. And this was really a response to growing trends of segregation and concentration of poverty in France. That was really at the roots of the program. 20 years ago, this law that stands for the Loi Solidarité et Renouvellement Urbain, which can be translated roughly as solidarity and urban renewal law, not the urban renewal connotations that we could have in the US context. It was adopted in France. It required municipalities, approximately 1,200, to devote 25% of their stock to social housing. And initially, it was set to 20%, but then in 2013, it was sort of increased, and now the percentage is 25%. The major goal was really to inject more social mix in the local zoning code of French municipalities, what we call the PLU, which is another, we love acronyms where all planners, housers, acronyms are at the core of what we do and our language. So the PLU was supposed to incorporate more regulations that would make social mix in housing mandatory. And construction objectives were supposed to be outlined ranging between 10 and 15 years, showing that those municipalities that were targeted by the program were going to make the necessary efforts to meet the goals and to meet what was required of them. So the law represented a true place-based shift for a country, for France, that had been characterized by people-based social housing policymaking since the mid-70s. An overall contextualization of my finding shows that the percentage of social housing in the overall French housing stock has hardly changed in 20 years. It's not about increasing the stock of social housing. It was more about rebalancing and making territories that were lacking, sometimes some of them, 0% social housing, have them, play their role and build more social housing and participate to the national effort. That was really also at the core of the program. So you have to project yourself in the 2000s, take the highly intense context of France that is going through a big social crisis, especially with its famous historically disinvested neighborhoods called the banlieues. Everybody's worried about the banlieue's future, and these neighborhoods concentrate a lot of the social housing stock at the moment. And add to it longer term trends, a combined relative retreat of the state from social housing production towards more home ownership subsidies in the 70s, and also a devolution of housing policy prerogatives to the local and municipal levels in the 80s. So political figures back then, particularly on the left, just think that it's necessary to implement a national program that is aimed at rebalancing the geographic location of social housing units. And that's when the SRU was born. To compare it with the American context, the SRU is a stronger affordability mandate that any US state has implemented so far, including the fair share initiatives introduced by Massachusetts Chapter 40B in 1969. And it goes beyond the inclusionary zoning rules in place in many cities, since it applies not just to new construction, but rather to all housing units. Chapter 40B has helped generate more than 60,000 affordable units since the early 70s. Over half of these units are reserved for households with incomes below 80% of the area median. And inclusionary zoning laws like this one's have also been tried in Oregon, California, Pennsylvania, New Jersey. So I do think there is room for an inspiration or a policy sort of transfer, or getting this SRU model as a model for tentative pilot programs or just strengthening existing ones. As a reminder, it has been a success, and a big part of my work is to underline areas for improvement. But generally speaking, the law has been a success. One of the best students I quoted two examples that could be a good inspiration or a good element of comparison with Rhode Island. I took Paris, which is one of the best students of this program, or one of the best sort of illustrations. It went from 14 to 22% of its entire housing stock devoted to social housing units. And it has the goal of reaching 30% by 2030 with strong motivation from the local elected officials and a multidimensional approach to building, or just generally speaking, creating more social housing. Another example, which I think is much more comparable to Rhode Island for all kinds of metrics, is in Brittany, with the city or the metropolitan area of Rennes and also other smaller towns, which have been doing tremendously well following the SRU program. And I think there is area for comparison and drawing lessons from that specific local case study. So generally speaking, it has been a success. And I will take 2 more minutes. Is that okay? Just to wrap up, because I'm seeing a few messages. Yeah, okay, perfectly. Just to draw, conclusions and recommendations that can work for the Rhode Island context. I know that the French context is really an oddity in that publicly owned housing forms a large share of rental housing. And you also have private rental markets that are strictly regulated by the national government. We've established that. Still, it's really about the way both, in progressive circles in France and in the US and in Rhode Island, residents and advocates talk about the way we need to be supply side advocates. The consensus is that pitting market rate and affordable housing against one another is inaccurate and counterproductive. Both are necessary and both advance the larger goal of affordability. And I want to insist on, so I showed that, for instance, the case of Paris was this perfect example that needs to be inspiring, maybe for Rhode Island advocates, policymakers, decision makers, and I can dive into that in the Q&A. I also picked Rennes because I think Rennes was doing badly originally before the law started, and then it just reversed its whole strategy and approach to housing. And I think that's, we don't need to just hear about people who were doing well and then a program was implemented and they kept on doing well. We also need to hear about mid-sized and smaller size cities that just completely reversed their strategy and approach to housing policymaking. And as a conclusion, I'll just wrap up by saying that in terms of recommendations, it's been successful, the SRU law, and it can probably have a lot of elements that can be adapted to the American context. So for instance, a quick list, which I tried to summarize here. I thought that we could just underscore the 4 following elements of the SRU program that could be, good lessons for Rhode Island, switching from incentive density bonuses and weaker programs to stronger mandatory ones. Another one is the strong use of eminent domain and, just putting in place penalties, the high fees. There could be higher in France. That's my main argument, generally speaking, but putting penalties and fees in place and also just enforcing multi-level, sheriff work or police work around housing policy making at the local level, just to make sure that at the local level everything about this program is implemented and followed or respected. And then, of course, when I say all of this, and I think the first presentation was also insisting on that, there's no one single solution to the housing crisis. So it's not just about this one program that I talked about extensively today. It's multidimensional. It's has to take a comprehensive approach and a large coalition to make things better and to fix the housing crisis. And then lastly, insisting on, and that's really at the core of the program in France and the current housing policy in France, just going after the exclusionary municipalities in any way we can, with any strategy, with any tool or mandate. And yeah, going after them is the solution, is one of the solutions to fix this situation. Thank you so much for your time, and I'll stop sharing my screen, I guess.
All right. Well, thank you,